coherent at any point. That's probably why. Also, the Chinese internet, as you all likely know, is not the most stable thing in the world, especially when connecting outside of China. So we have some contingency plans in place in case things go down or if things start breaking up. So as Karen mentioned, my name is Chris Boehner. I'm the executive director of Vericant. And basically what we do is we're a third-party video interview service. We're not agents or consultants. We don't help place kids, but we act as a third party here in China. So schools are able to take an honest look at each of their applicants. Everything that I'm going to be talking about today, I have a PDF that I put together. It's at vericant.com/SSAT. So if you go there, feel free to download a PDF. It's got a bunch of bullet points because, as you'll see with this presentation, there actually aren't many bullet points as I'll be speaking. So I've been in China. I moved here in 2006, which means I've been here for about 7 years. And I'm going to take really the key points that I've learned about China, and I'm going to try to compress that into about 40 minutes. Now, the first thing people ask about me when I go to the United States is they say, Chris, why on earth did you move to China? And I say, well, it's pretty easy. I really like Chinese food, so I figured it would be a good place to go. The real reason is actually because of this gentleman. His name is Vladimir Tausig. This picture was taken in 1938 on the Bund in Shanghai. These two buildings in the background still exist there, and I was just there actually this past weekend in that very spot. But this is my grandfather, and he spent 10 years in China back in the 30s and 40s, escaping Nazi Germany. He's a Jewish man from Czechoslovakia. So I quite literally have China in my blood. Another reason I moved is I really wanted to learn Mandarin Chinese. I love the language and realized that it would require moving to China to actually learn the language. Now, since moving here, I've noticed what I would call a disconnect. And it's really a cultural disconnect between the United States, or really Western culture, in China. China's got a very long history, and they do things much different here. Things are much different here. And I really like business case studies, so I want to compare and contrast what we're seeing in admissions to a business case study, and that's Best Buy. So about 9 years ago, Best Buy entered the Chinese market, and they came and they took their U.S. business model and applied it to the Chinese market. And it's just like the Best Buy that you and I know in the United States. They have really big stores, they have their own staff, and they're full they stock their own goods there to sell. Now they have to train their staff on each of the items so they can sell the goods properly, and customers come in and buy. Well, Best Buy had Chinese competitors who wanted to get in the space, and instead of having the same model as Best Buy, they changed it a bit. They still had one really big store, but they actually sectioned it into smaller little stores what they would rent out to different retailers, and these different retailers would would have their own people to sell there. So they knew their products very well. And also it meant that there was no overhead for the Chinese competitors because they didn't stock their own goods. All the manufacturers did. So about 2 years ago, Best Buy actually shut their doors in China because they couldn't compete with this Chinese business model. And anyone who spent any time in China or any expert that studies China knows exactly what they did wrong. And many companies have done this here. And that's what I would call a cut and paste model. So they took something from the United States and they pasted it in China. And it didn't work. And the reason I bring this up is because I'm seeing something happen that's very, very similar in our admissions process. Because the way that we assess American applicants, or even I would say Western applicants, is different. And we look at students in a three-dimensional way. We want to see teacher recommendations. We'd like to see their transcripts. We want to have a one-to-one interview with them. We want to see what they have to say about themselves and what they think they can add to our classrooms. Whereas in China, it's very, very different. You're just a number. It's a very one-dimensional approach. Your academic ability is determined by the one score that you get at the end of your high school career. Now, I travel quite a lot, so I'd like to break this presentation into different levels of thinking. So we're going to start at about 50,000 feet, and we're going to look at the Chinese education system and then compare that to the Western education system. Then we're going to go drop down to 30,000 feet, where we're going to look at some of the key players in the market. We're going to look at students, we're going to look at parents, and then we're also going to look at agents or education consultants. Next, we'll drop down to 10,000 feet. And at 10,000 feet, we'll take a look at different assessment methods that we use in the United States and how they're being used in China and if they're effective or not. And lastly, the runway, we'll just take a look at some of the different philosophies when approaching the Chinese market and how thinking might need to change. So first, let's start at 50,000 feet, the Chinese education system. So Chinese have always highly valued education. They believe that the educated individual benefits the family and benefits overall society. Chinese education is based on something called the imperial exam. And the imperial exam existed to select the most intelligent Chinese to represent their local provinces in the Beijing, or not Beijing at the time, but in the government. So the highly coveted Mandarin position. And this is the world's first standardized testing. We actually got the idea of standardized testing from China, from this imperial exam. And it was seen as the only fair way to assess talent, because otherwise people could have favoritism in the process and get people they knew, maybe family members, into the government, which wouldn't be good for society. Now on this test, you had to memorize works of art or works of literature by people like Confucius, Mencius, and other Chinese sages. And notice that I said memorize. I did not say learn. The idea of memorization is very rote in Chinese culture. And I can tell you from a personal perspective that you cannot make any progress in the language itself without memorizing. When I first came to China, I thought, oh, I'll be in China, I'll start picking up Mandarin, people will be speaking it around me. Well, that's really not the case. I did that for about a year and noticed I was getting nowhere with my Chinese. And it wasn't until I had a tutor come to my house every day for 2 hours, and then I would sit for 2 to 4 hours after she left and copy characters and say the names to myself to memorize them. So memorization is very deeply ingrained in the Chinese mind. Now the modern day equivalent of the imperial exam is something called the Gaokao. And if you've read the news at all or know anything about China, you've seen that there's this big scary test that happens at the end of high school, and this is the Gaokao. It's the backbone of the Chinese education system and is the sole determinant in which university you attend here in China. Time magazine has described this as the most pressure-packed exam in the world, and they're not lying. This takes place over 2 to 3 days depending on what your subject of study is, and it's 4 hours each time. The city shuts down. It's amazing when Gaokao begins because the city falls silent. And now I'm in Beijing. It's a city of 25 million people. And cabs will stop and pick up students for free. People will put signs in the back of their car saying, this is a Gaokao student, please get out of the way because we need to get to the exam center. Now I asked my Chinese colleague, how can I really explain this to a Western audience? How can I let them understand how big this is in the Chinese student's life? And she said, well, Chris, it's not so different from the day that you get married or the first child you have. It's a major life event. And if you keep this in mind, this idea of the Gaokao, everything that confuses you about China or Chinese students applying to our schools will suddenly make sense. Now, let's compare that to the Western education system, because sometimes we forget what it's like to be within our own system. So we're based on Greek and Roman tradition, and we believe in critical thinking. We listen to what philosophers said, famous people, but we also are able to argue with them. And if we have a well-documented, supported argument, it's okay to disagree with somebody. We also we really like oratory skills, being persuasive. These things are what we value in Western society and hope to impart on our students so they'll be successful later in life. To give a personal example, now I'm an Asheville School graduate in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, and I really love bluegrass music. Our senior year, while my Chinese peers were in China studying every single day, hours on end for the Gaokao, I was writing two 20-page papers on this gentleman in the middle. And I don't know if any of you will know who he is, but his name is Bill Monroe, and he is the father of bluegrass music. And I wrote these two 20-page papers and also gave an oral defense in front of our entire English department about how this gentleman was able to take his style of music and actually turn it into a genre that's still played today. Now, I think a Chinese parent may look at this and say, that's not education. Whereas in the West, we can easily see how being able to take something you're passionate about and create arguments and spend a lot of time studying it actually is very, very academically sound. And one last point to compare and contrast our two systems. If you look at the leadership of our two countries, and this is actually an outdated photograph because the leader of China is no longer Hu Jintao, it's Xi Jinping. But if you look at what type of backgrounds our presidents have, it's quite telling. And we know most American presidents have a degree usually in law. They've gone to law school or have some background in law. Whereas in China, most of the leaders actually have a background in, can anyone guess? Engineering. So most Chinese leaders have a background in engineering. So again, I think this really shows what the two different countries value or two different cultures value in their leadership. So next, let's drop down to 30,000 feet, and let's look at some of the key players in the market here. So students, parents, and education consultants or agents. And since we're mostly schools here, let's talk about students first, because that's why we're all here. Now, in 2006, visa regulations changed, and we had a lot more students beginning to apply to the United States. 2006, I believe there were 64 Chinese students in our private schools, and I saw a statistic, I guess it was last week from Wall Street Journal, saying that there's over 26,000 Chinese students in private American high schools. Now, that's inclusive of boarding schools and day schools. But that's a huge increase over just a 7-year time period. And so why are they coming? Well, a lot of them, they've seen a lot of American television. They know that America has some of the best education institutions in the world. They also don't really want to spend all their time memorizing. A lot of them can kind of see past of how memorization is not really going to be helpful for them later in life. It's not going to lead to success necessarily. And can you blame them? They really don't want to take the Gaokao. The Gaokao, they're going to have, puts tremendous pressure on them their entire life. And if their parents think that they're not going to be one of the top students on the Gaokao and be able to attend some of the prestigious universities in China, they'd much rather them go to the United States and go to a university in the United States. There's something that's special about Chinese students, and this has been happening since the late 70s, early 80s, is the one-child policy. And this has created something called the Scalloping D in Chinese, which means the little emperor. And this basically means that there's only one child, and they tend to be quite spoiled since it's one child. And it's not just because they're an only child, it's because they have 6 adults showering all of their time, attention, and money on this one student. So you have mom and dad and grandma and grandpa on both sides that are putting one pressure on the student, but also are dedicating all of their resources to these students. Now, this is a picture of Shanghai in 1990. Actually, if you look in the bottom left corner here, those are the 2 buildings that were in the photograph with my grandfather from earlier. So this is Shanghai in 1990. And most of the students applying to our schools now were born in 97, 98, 99 or so. And this is a picture of the same perspective 20 years later. So 2010, this is what Shanghai looks like. This is the rate of development these students are used to. This is normal for them. This was built during their lifetimes and what they've been seeing. Let's take a look at that again. Just a tremendous rate of growth in China. And the last thing to keep in mind about your Chinese applicants is that when they decide to leave the Chinese system, they are putting all of their chips to the middle of the table. This means as soon as they remove themselves, it's really difficult for them to get back into the Chinese system. I've heard stories of when a Chinese student requests a transcript from their school, they actually make them sign a piece of paper saying that they will not reapply to the school because they do not want the Gaokao scores of that school to lower if that student does not do well. The reason for this is schools are ranked, high schools are ranked in China based on their Gaokao scores. So if Gaokao score is lower, it makes the school get less funding. Also, teacher bonuses and the administration of the schools, their salary is tied to the Gaokao scores coming from the school. Not to mention the prestige of being at one of the top high schools in China that send the most kids to Peking University or to Tsinghua. So that's so to keep an idea of where these students are coming from. Now, let's talk a little bit about mom and dad. So, like any parent, they want their children to experience the world. They want them to have, they want them to be able to have all the experiences that they weren't able to have as children, and give them the best experience possible so they become successful adults. One big difference about Chinese parents and grandparents even is that they lived through the Cultural Revolution. And this isn't a history lesson, so I'm not going to go much into it, but this time in China was very, very volatile. If you want to learn more about the Cultural Revolution, or really what life has been like in China over the past I guess, 70 or 80 years, I highly recommend that you find this movie. It's by Zhang Yimou, and it's called To Live, and it follows a family, a wealthy family in the 1940s who goes broke because the father gets addicted to drinking and gambling, and then the Red Guards come, and it's a very up and down story. But you can really see how difficult it has been in China for a lot of these parents and grandparents. Another thing is that the savings rate in China is very, very high, 25%. In the United States, I think that it's recommended that you save 10%, though it seems that it's much less than that with the amount of credit card debt in the country. And Chinese parents are very willing to spend this on education for their child. So there's a lot of resources. And remember, this is also not coming just from mom and dad. It's coming from grandma and grandpa as well. Also, Chinese parents do not really speak English. If you're lucky if you have a parent who does speak English, which is one reason why they tend to work with education consultants. We'll talk about that more later. But this is a really nice, clean website, the Web Schools. It's really easy for us to navigate. We can find anything we want. But when a Chinese parent visits a page like this, it kind of looks like this might to you. You know, they have no idea where to begin. It's a completely foreign language, and it's difficult for them even to do a very basic, or what we think is a fairly straightforward admissions process, and that's why they rely on a lot of outside people to help them. Now, there are 3 words that Chinese parents all know, and that's Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. So the reason that they know these names, they're brand name schools, and it's something that they trust. They really don't understand what the U.S. education system is. You know, we have the benefit of growing up in the United States. We've seen organized sport. We know what all these different colleges and universities are, and generally know kind of what their reputation is. But Chinese don't really have that luxury. So they're really basing on hearsay of what they know are the good schools. They will refer to lists. I'm sure many of you have heard of these infamous lists in China that rank the schools, and who knows how they're ranked. But this is really the only thing that Chinese parent has to go on. You know, if I asked you guys to rank the top universities in China, you know, could you? I mean, you would want to probably see a list of saying, all right, well, let's see which one are the best schools. Maybe you would know Peking University, Beida, or Tsinghua University, maybe Fudan University in Shanghai. But after that, it gets a little bit tricky to know which universities are well regarded in China. In the Chinese parent mind, the proximity to Boston is usually an indicator of how good your school is. And the reason for that, obviously, is because there's so many very highly regarded schools that are located in Boston. So for those of you that are near Boston, that's a very good thing. You're very lucky because you will have more interest in your school just because you are closer to Boston. And I can understand why they think this. Is because in China it's very similar. If you look at China, a lot of people say it looks like a rooster. If you look at the rooster's neck here, that's kind of where Beijing is, and it's pretty similar to where Boston might be. And then Shanghai is a little bit closer down towards Taiwan there. But the top universities in China are located in these major cities, and additionally, they are ranked. You know, they have a ranking here in China of the best universities, and they base it all on the Gaokao score. So it's a very clear-cut system, and that's why the U.S. system is so confusing for them, because we say, well, each school is special, and they each do something different. It depends on the fit and personality of your student. This is really confusing for them. The last thing that we tend to forget in the U.S., and I know I'm very guilty of this as well, is we forget how dangerous our country is. You know, we were reminded of this recently, unfortunately. You know, we have guns in our country, and in China there are no guns. This morning I walked out of my apartment at about 3 a.m. I walked down a very long dark alley to go get a cab to come to my office, and I didn't feel any bit of danger. I walked by several people that were walking down the street, didn't feel at all that I was in any danger. Whereas if I was in New York City or even my hometown of Aiken, South Carolina, I would certainly think twice about doing that. So what this is doing is creating a perfect storm. And that's where our next person comes in. We have basically schools in the United States who want to add diversity to campus and have these Chinese students on campus because it adds a really nice flavor to our schools. You have parents who really want to send their kids who've been watching American television and really want to go become more global, to become international and learn in the United States. And that's where the next person comes in. That's the education consultant. Or in Chinese, it's called a Chongzhou. And that literally means a middleman. So I'm going to refer to these people as agents because generally in China they're agents and not education consultants. An education consultant collects their fees only from the family, whereas an agent collects fees from schools and from the families. And just as a tip for anyone out there that is paying agent fees, I would highly recommend that you don't do that because there's just so much demand over here to get into school. Pretty much any agent will work with you even if they're not collecting fees for placing students. So why do middlemen or agents exist in China? Well, let me tell you. China is a very, very complicated place. For the registration of our company, Vericant, it took me 6 months to get our company properly registered here as a business. In the U.S., you just need to go to the courthouse and you've got a company in about half an hour. Here it took me 6 months and we used an agent. Had we not used an agent, it would have taken us closer to a year to get everything registered. And the reason for that is because you need to go to about 23 different places to get your business registered. You have to get certain pieces of paper, and you have to make sure you get your CHOP or your red stamp in the right place, and you have to have your signature in English, or do you have to have it in Chinese, or do you need to go to this bureau first or that bureau first, or do you have to get approval from the bank before you can go see this person? It's really complicated, and that's why you hire professionals that understand the system and can go and do things for you very efficiently here. It's just how things work in China, and that's why Chinese families turn to agents right away when it comes to something confusing, like applying to school in the United States. Now, very briefly, what the business model looks like for these agencies here in China. For the average kind of competitive, large-scale education consultancy, they'll charge about $5,500, though I've heard all the way up to $80,000 to place a student in a school. What they do is they'll help you apply to about 6 schools, additional ones if you want to pay more fees for that, and they guarantee admission to at least one of those schools. Otherwise, you get a full refund back on your payment. Now, the first thing that they do when you sign with them is that they actually cut all communication between the family, the students, and the school. So all the communication that goes between your office and what you think may be the student or family is usually going through a consultant or an agent. So I'm sure many of you have seen similar email addresses to this. This is an example. Wang Jingyi is a Chinese name. And then we have 2013, the application year, at 163.com. 163 is like Gmail or any of those other free email addresses. And they create this email address and apply to schools underneath it. So a lot of times when you are talking to someone you think is the student, actually many times you're speaking with the education consultant. Now let's go and talk a little bit about assessment methods. So dropping down to 10,000 feet. First, teacher recommendations. So teacher recommendations are a great way in the U.S. to have a better understanding of how the student may behave in class, around classmates, how they interact with teachers. This startling statistic came up recently. 90% of teacher recommendations falsified. This was by Zinch China, maybe about 3 years ago. A gentleman named Tom Melcher came up with this statistic. And I asked one of my friends, an American friend who's an education consultant here, and I said, you know, Matthew, do you really think 90% of teacher recommendations are falsified here? And he said, Chris, that number is definitely wrong. There's no way that 90% of teacher recommendations are falsified. It's more like 99%. And the reason for that is because there's no need for teacher recommendations in this country. They do not exist because of the Gaokao. There's no need for for teachers to know how well their students are doing, the personalities of their students, because it just matters what they get on this one test. So they'll look at students' standardized test scores as they go through school, but they're really not going to have a good idea of their personalities. Additionally, these classrooms, there's about 60 students in each class, and these teachers are teaching 6 periods a day. That's a lot of students to know personally. Additionally, since they don't exist here in China, they do not know how to write them. They don't speak English, so it's not going to be done in English. And even if you had them in Chinese and translated, they don't even know what to write about a student in Chinese. They don't know what they're supposed to write because they just have never had to do anything like this before. So if you are looking at teacher recommendations and considering them, if they're from an international school in China, there's a chance that they are accurate. But generally, if they're coming from a public school in China, I wouldn't look at them. They're really not worth it. This is part of the service of an education consultant or an agent to create these because the students can't get these from schools. So when we require these teacher recommendations, we're having students put them in a very awkward situation because they're not going to get them from their teachers and they have to find another way to procure them. Next, transcripts. Now, transcripts are a great way to see a student's performance over time in their classroom. And it's a very good predictor of success when they actually come to your school. Well, in China, transcripts are just not used like we use them in the United States. They're not weighted heavily at all. And can you guess why? Because of the Gaokao. Really, the only thing that matters in school are your standardized test scores that you take in preparation for the Gaokao. You'll take about 4 tests per year during high school that continue throughout, leading up to the Gaokao. I've heard stories of teachers here. They'll actually purposely give you very low scores on your transcript so it motivates you to study harder for the Gaokao. Because they think, well, if they have a D on their transcript, it doesn't matter. It really just matters what they get on the Gaokao. And where we run into problems is because this is very commonly known in China, but when it goes to the United States, Chinese schools think, well, these American schools don't know that we do this, or they don't know how difficult our system is. They don't understand how our grading system works, so we'll change these grades so they reflect more of how they would look in the American system. So again, the transcripts are not a reliable way to look at a student here in China. Next, Skype. So this has been the revolutionizer of international admissions since it came out, I hope we're doing all right now, and I'm not cutting in and out at all. But the internet connection here in China is not the most reliable thing, and also it's really not reliable in general here in China using Skype because you really never know who's on the other end. I've visited probably 80 boarding schools over the past 2 years, and just talking to admission officers, I've heard just a litany of stories about Skype calls with Chinese applicants that are just, a lot of them are very, very hilarious. And one of the ones I'd like to share with you is this one I call the cat in the lap story. So this admission officer was interviewing this young girl in China, and at the beginning of the interview, she noticed that there was this black cat sitting in the girl's lap. And she thought, well, that's strange, but let's go ahead with the interview. And about 15 minutes into the interview, this cat lifted its head up, and that's when the admission officer realized it was not a cat that was in this girl's lap. It was actually her mother's head whispering answers to her as she took the interview. So now, while Skype is a better way to speak with applicants, certainly much better than a phone interview, it's not foolproof here in China. Next, standardized testing. Standardized testing in China, obviously Chinese students are going to be very, very good at this because this is what they are taught their entire life. This is the way they're taught to study is how to how to learn about different problems. I was looking at a Chinese textbook, and it's so interesting to see the way that they teach these students standardized tests, because they won't teach them the ideas and just how the things work. They'll say, all right, on this test you'll have 60 different types of questions. So let's analyze each of these different types of questions, and we'll find how to always find the right answer for these different types of questions. So you really just memorize how to do each type of question, and then you can always get the right answers on these. And now, while standardized testing is a great way to see certain skills, it's not a full picture of the student, and especially for Chinese students, they're going to score pretty well on these like for example SSAT, but not necessarily have the communication ability to do well in the classroom, which I'm sure many of you have seen. Additionally, it's things like the TOEFL. We have something called the Chongzhou in Chinese. The Chongzhou is what's literally called a hired gun. And last year there was a scandal in Hong Kong where 3 of these Chongzhous were caught. This is somebody you pay about $2,000 that looks similar to you. You'll fly them to Hong Kong or Bangkok or some other international destination, because security is quite high now in China, to take this test for you. And they'll score very well, but it's not actually the student taking the test. So, while standardized testing is one good piece to the puzzle, it's definitely not, you can't rely 100% on one standardized test score to evaluate the ability of these students. Now, the absolute best way to understand your Chinese applicants is for you to come over here and visit Beijing, or visit Shanghai or Wuhan or Chongzhou. Come over to this country and really see where these students are coming from. Your perspective will completely change, because China always amazes everyone when they come. It's funny, the expectations are quite different from when Americans, I should say, come over here and actually experience the culture. This also has its shortcomings, and it's difficult. If you have 100, 200 Chinese applicants, it's really difficult to interview them on a 2-week Asia trip. And also, the thing that I struggle with about 14 times a year is jet lag. So, jet lag's a killer, and it's definitely no fun to be interviewing students when you can barely keep your eyes open. So that's basically the different sorts of assessment methods we're seeing over here, and that are used in the United States. So let's hop down to the runway. Now, when I started Vericant about 2 years ago, I had this idea, and I saw this problem of there's just a problem. There's a lack of verified information coming out of China. And I thought, well, this is easy. I will go ahead and I'll find these teachers, make sure teacher recommendations are real. I'll check all these awards, make sure they've actually been awarded. I'll look at transcripts. I'll find a way to verify them. And as we talked about, I just found that would just be worthless. It wouldn't be actually helpful to see how well the student performs, to see actually who they are. So verifying these materials just wouldn't really be helpful. Again, we go back to this cut and paste. We took what was going on in the United States or in Western culture, our admissions process that we use for American applicants and for generally Western applicants, it works pretty well. In applying it to China, but we see all these shortcomings. Like, it's not working, and there's always a way, always a way to game the system over here. So the question comes up is, what does work in China? And there are lots of people trying to figure this out. Anyone who comes over here and starts a business or trying to cooperate with China in some way, it's a constant battle between our two cultures and our understanding of what's normal, what's moral, what's okay, what's not okay. And so this wouldn't be a presentation about China without some ancient Chinese wisdom. So I will offer this Chinese phrase, which is 随机改变. And this means to change according to the situation. And to me, this really means, when you approach China or you approach anything that's fundamentally different from what you're used to, is that you need to start questioning everything. Start from the base, really get into the minds of the people you're trying to work with and figure out their perspective and how best to work with that. I see that as being very agile. When you're looking at the Chinese applicant pool, and when you're coming over here and testing different ways, and to be adaptive, I would say it would be a detriment to stick to the old ways just because that's the way you've always done something. When it's obviously not working in a way that's benefiting your school or the students. If you've put in a really good admission process that's getting top Chinese applicants, everybody wins. The Chinese families wins, the Chinese student wins, your campus wins, and at the end of the day, when you have these students on campus, they're obviously wonderful. Being in China, I wouldn't have lived here for 7 years if I didn't love it. And I've learned just an incredible amount from Chinese culture. I've learned, as you guys might understand, persistence from living over here. And it's been a wonderful understanding, or developing an understanding, stepping back from what I assume is normal, my American upbringing, and really stepping into another culture's shoes and understanding why we're different and how we can find ways to cooperate. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Karen, and we will go through the Q&A. So thank you all very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Chris, that was awesome. Thank you so much. So far, we only have one question from Olga Bueno, and she's asking, oh, here come a couple more. She's asking, is the Gaokao only taken at the end of high school, or is it taken every year? Do middle school students take the Gaokao?
The middle school students do not take one. They actually take one called the Zhongkao. So Zhong means middle in Chinese, and Gao means high. So this is the middle exam. So they do take an exam, and I'll answer this question before someone asks it, so I'm sure they will. I have not found a way to get those scores yet. I'm looking into it to see if there's a way that we can find these scores or have them reported to U.S. schools. But keep in mind that this is the Chinese system, so it's measuring something very different than what you may consider a standardized test to measure in the U.S. And also for the Gaokao, it's only taken at the end of your senior year. It's given once a year, and you need to be a senior to take it. Now, if you're late to the exam, you cannot take it. You have to wait an entire other year before you can take it again. And some students do that. And I forgot what it is, but there's actually a special name for kids who did not do well enough on their Gaokao, and then they spend the entire next year, instead of going to university, studying again for the Gaokao. And I'm sorry I can't remember the name of that in Chinese.
Wow, that's incredible. Christian Gall is asking, is there any way to determine if an agency is trustworthy?
That's a very good question. I mean, it comes down, and I actually, I should have mentioned this because every China presentation has this word in it. It's called guanxi in Chinese, and it's relationships. So everything in China is based on relationships, basically within the family and then your circle of friends. And it's really important to maintain relationships. If before you work with any sort of agent or consultant here in China, I'd highly recommend that you come over here and visit them, see who they're working with, the volume of students that they're working with, to see if they are giving individual care to each student. Ask for tons of references for different schools, because people will tell you right away whether or not they've been satisfied with one of these agents. But you just need to be very careful, because there's no barrier to entry here in China. So it's not really a regulated industry like it should be. It is, on one level, yes, there's education licenses that you have to have, but there's only 410 or so that exist in the country. But it's just so hard to regulate being an education consultant or an agent. There's just tons and tons of different people, and I'm sure that your email boxes are just flooded with people every day saying, hi, I'm an agent based in China, I can get some students to come to your school, blah, blah, blah. So just be really careful, do your homework, and don't move too fast. Take it really slow, and definitely call references.
Okay, I have a couple of people asking, how reliable are TOEFL and SLEP scores, particularly when the tests are taken in China?
Sure. Never look at the SLEP. And I know that's an SSAT product, but I also know that it was discontinued last year. It's a low-stakes test, and it's given in an office. So I would say, if someone says, oh, we can't take the SSAT because we missed the date, it's a pretty common technique here. Wait to the last minute. not being able to sign up, we'll send you a SLEP score instead. Yeah, that's just kind of a trick so you don't have to sit the SSAT or another high-stakes test. The SLEP does not exist anymore, and they're just using old copies of it, basically, to assess students, which, yeah, just don't look at SLEP scores. TOEFL scores are quite reliable, but the thing about a TOEFL score that's tricky is that there's no interactive component. So there's no point in the exam where you're actually interacting with a native English speaker. So you can see how well they test in English, but you can't see actually how well that they will communicate when they're in a classroom setting or just in a one-to-one setting. And that's why a lot of times you'll see someone with, wow, they have a 90 on their TOEFL, but you get into a room with them and you chat with them and think, wow, how on earth did you get a 90 on TOEFL? Because it's really hard just to hold a conversation. They're prepping for the TOEFL because it tests certain abilities in English, but not the whole spectrum.
Okay. Larry Jensen's asking, how reliable are other documents like health records and birth certificates?
I would just say be skeptical of any document coming out of China. And the reason I've heard I forgot who I heard this from, but I heard a story about they were counterfeiting. I think at a lot of schools you need to have a chest x-ray before you go, I think maybe for TB or something like that. And I heard that there were people counterfeiting those from China, just so they didn't realize they had to do it and wanted to get it done right away, so they sent a counterfeit chest x-ray. So you got to be really careful for any sort of documentation coming from China. Yeah, just look at everything with a very careful eye.
Okay, Christian Gall asks again, we work with a U.S. consultant that sets up homestays and screens applicants for us. We have no idea how they screen. What questions should we ask?
Oh, good question. So that's a little tricky, and it's because it sounds like they're an education consultant and they are doing the screening, which to me kind of it's a little bit of conflict of interest there. And that's why we don't do any sort of placement or consulting with students because we're an independent third party. So I'm trying to think of what questions you can ask. I would honestly say that you need to talk to the students. Have them round up. They say, I want to talk to your top 10 students, top 20 students. I don't know how many students you're considering for your school. But we'd like for you to filter to a certain amount, and then we want to talk to them after that. And I'd highly recommend that you spend the money on a plane ticket to China and meet them face-to-face here in China, because you really never know what you're getting, especially when there's conflict of interest there.
Okay, this is sort of a related question. What line of questioning do you find effective when interviewing Chinese students, many of whom seem scripted and prepared to say all the right things or have?
Sure, yeah, they totally are. They are very, very good prep, test prep. And I love going on the Chinese internet, and you guys don't have this luxury, but if you have any Chinese speakers, search for your school name on Baidu and then have them in Chinese type interview questions, and you'll be shocked when you see all of the questions that you ask these students on Skype pop up. And we monitor those really closely, and we just, at Vericant, we don't ask any of those types of questions. For example, I was in Shanghai this past weekend. I was interviewing students, and one of the first question I started the interview with was not, hello, where are you from? I said, what's the first thing you do when you get out of bed in the morning? And I asked, we really work on behavioral-based questions. So we want to pull them out of memorized scripts. So you'll see them. A lot of times they've memorized something. It's pretty easy to spot after you've interviewed a few. Eyes kind of drift up a little bit, and then they just start reciting. And you need to interrupt them and have them further explain a point they made, or really just make them have create language. If you ask them why do you want to go to school in the United States, every single one has a very polished answer when you speak with them. So one is don't ask the same questions to all the different applicants, and two, be very, very creative with the type of questions. Don't feel afraid to interrupt when you're talking with them, because that will throw them off track if, in fact, it is a memorized response.
Christine Maitland says, my school only takes Chinese Canadian applicants in China. They tend to go to British or American schools in China. Does the trouble with the transcripts, et cetera, happen in these schools as well?
Not to my knowledge. You know, if you're looking with international schools, it's totally different. They're managed a totally different way here in China because they are foreign owned in most of the international schools. So you can feel more confident when you're looking at transcripts and teacher recommendations coming from these schools.
Okay. Lindsay Walter's asking, as we're about to start reading files, is there anything in the application that's reliable and we should be reading closely?
Good question. I would say, you know, you really need to weigh the interview very heavily with Chinese applicants. I think SSAT as well is a good indicator, but not the complete picture. Teacher recommendations just don't look at them. I would say transcripts, again, not reliable. And especially the view books. I'm sure your offices are flooded with these very flowery, thick, beautifully printed books. And I didn't mention this actually. This is where the agents make, especially the higher end, or not higher end, the larger companies, they make a lot of their money by add-on services. So they'll say, all right, well, you pay your $5,500, but of course you'll need a view book when you apply to this school. So we'll help you make that and mail it for a fee of X dollars. And of course, as you know, in China, the Gaokao is very important. So is the SSAT. So you're going to need to buy test prep from us as well. And it's very, very much an upsell type process for these agencies.
Interesting. Mark DeFabio is saying, we use a U.S.-based agency and they set up the Skype for us. How do we know that the student we see on Skype is the actual student?
You don't. Again, you know, if they're acting any sort of screening role or anything like that, you know, it's conflict of interest too. Just because they're based in the U.S. I know a few. I've seen that, you know, you just have you have a China office and a U.S. office, and the way that a lot of U.S. Agencies work. So I shouldn't say a lot, but some work like this, where basically if they want to help recruit Chinese students for U.S. schools, but they don't know anything about China, they'll work with a network of agencies here to get different students into school. So it's kind of, there's two middlemen in that situation. So the agency will refer students to the U.S. agency, and the U.S. agency will refer them to the schools. So there's 2 points where the communication can be blurred a little bit. So actually, it could be even that the U.S. schools are being, or excuse me, the U.S. consultants being misled by the China-based agents that they're recruiting from.
Christian asks, we've had some students come to us to interview. Anything to be suspicious of or concerned about there?
That's great. No, I think it's, again, you know, the face-to-face interaction is wonderful and highly encouraged. The one thing that I have heard for a lot of schools is that it just, especially if you're near a big city, is that they come to the office really often. So they're calling the office, trying to schedule interviews, and for some schools, this has caused a problem because they take up all the interview slots of domestic students and other international students that are coming and applying. So, you know, as long as it's not getting out of control, I think it's great. But there may become a point in the future where this does get out of control, and you may want to require something beforehand, like an SSAT score, or some of our partner schools require our interview before they go to school or go to visit face-to-face on campus, just to see, you know, if they are the caliber that school works with.
Donna Miller's asking, and this is a sort of a cultural question, how should we deal with Chinese students who cheat academically? We are aware that they feel they're being resourceful and not cheating.
Yes, the clash of cultures. Yeah, it's, you know, and actually Karen and I were speaking about this right before the phone call, is that in China you have to keep in mind that you're competing with 1.4 billion people for any and everything. So while, you know, I remember when I was in college, everyone said, oh yes, Asia, they're all very collectivist cultures, whereas in the U.S. we're very individualist and we think ourselves are the most important people. Where it's funny because China's this weird mix of collective culture and individualism, and you know, there's this need to compete on everything. Like when I come to the office, people just jump in front of me on the elevator because they want to get in the elevator first. They don't have to wait for the next one. So there's these kind of you know, cultural differences of what's considered right and wrong or what's polite or impolite. Cheating is a huge issue, and you know, I think that you should hold, in the United States, I think you should hold your Chinese students to the exact same standard that you hold American students. But to do that, you really need to put a program in place when they first come to campus and have somebody who knows about China and says, listen guys, what you did in China will not work here. And kind of the mindset you have to get into is if you were to come over here to China to go to a Chinese school and you're asked to write a 5-paragraph essay about, I don't know, about something, and then you write it and you have this just beautiful essay. It's really creative, really well supported points, and just a very well written essay. And then you turn it into the teacher, and the teacher says, what's this? This isn't the right answer. This is wrong, and you get an F on it. So this is the kind of the mindset. They're going through the opposite way, saying, I just had to copy what I found in my book to get an A. Now I can't do that anymore. Well, I don't understand. So there's at some point, it's actually a lot of it is the school's responsibility to have some sort of month-long program or something to help transition these students into a Western environment, because it's so different from what they're coming into. But after if they're caught cheating, then absolutely. I mean, I think that you need to consider having them expelled from the school or probation the same way that you treat American students.
Christopher Merrill is asking, is there a way to create connections with the families of our Chinese students so we might foster relationships which might result in advancement opportunities for our school?
Sure, good question. That's another thing I'm asked a lot about is development, and it's something that I've been exploring as much as possible, especially every time Asheville School comes over, I'm always with them and speaking with some different alums over here just to learn more and see the best way to approach. Having a good relationship with families is the best way to ensure that it's a smooth relationship between the school and the family, both now and then in the future. So yeah, absolutely. You should be coming to China, and it should be your head of school, maybe your admissions director, director of development. But the important thing is not that the important thing is that you're coming frequently, you're valuing the relationship, and that they're meeting the same person each time. So it gets tricky with admission directors because they switch jobs, more frequently than head of school would. So it's good to develop long-term relationships with faculty that will be at the school for a long time. Now, of course, there's the language barrier. More and more parents, I'm finding, do speak English, which is a great thing. But when you come over, I mean, it's not expensive to have a translator with you. And just having a translator with you, maybe one of your current students. So I remember one time we had a banquet dinner here with some Asheville School kids. And it was so fun because I was speaking a bit of Chinese, which impressed the Chinese parents, but the Chinese kids who were currently studying at Asheville School, this was during the summer, they were doing the translation between the head of school and the parents. And it was really impressive for the parents to see how well their child was speaking English, and you felt this really tight connection in the room just by using them as the translators. So absolutely, every time you have a chance to come to China, come to China. Send gifts, small gifts. Last year, Asheville School they went around to all the Chinese students and took pictures of them on campus and put it in an Asheville School frame, and then gave them to the families here as a gift at dinner, which is a really nice gift that families enjoyed over here.
That's excellent. You've touched on this a little bit, but Larry Jensen writes, Chinese students arrive on an American boarding school campus and find many different nationalities. What's some good advice for deans of students and international student advisors to head off any problems and help Chinese students settle in quickly and well?
Yeah, that's tricky. And I'll say, just from a personal perspective, moving to China, it's really uncomfortable. I mean, my first 6 months in China was really difficult. Not being able to speak the language well, everything's strange. You can't do you can't even read a sign. When you're going to the subway, you can't read what a subway stop is. It's just really, you're all of a sudden reverted to this basically childhood before you could read or write when you come into a foreign culture like that. And being in the United States in the international environment for boarding school is really what makes the boarding school experience, I think, so special. But let me think for advice. If you guys have a chance, and I don't know if she's on the line, but Meta over at Northfield Mount Herman, she's really awesome at transitioning students to Northfield Mount Herman's life. So basically what she does is, I think it's once a week, I think every Thursday night or something. She has all the international students over at her house. And she's a bit special because she grew up abroad. She's a 3CK, a third culture kid. So she knows what it's like to be away from home. So she just has everyone together, all the international students. They cook food, they cook, sorry to say guys, but rice in the United States is terrible. It has nothing, you can't compare it to the rice here in Asia. So have kids over, let them cook rice, have Chinese meals, have Indian meals, whatever it is. Different cultures will create, they'll watch a local movie that's subtitled in English, but she'll actually really build a tight international community with the students, and she does that really, really well. So if you have somebody who spent time abroad and just has that visceral feeling of what it's like to live in a different culture, they can really relate to these kids in a way that someone who's never spent any time abroad, it's difficult for them to.
Okay. Matt Walensky is saying that they're at the breaking point. Their exploding applicant volume is demanding of our time and resources, and 2/3 of them are not the caliber that we're looking for, particularly since we don't have ESL. Any suggestions for communicating our standards better or pre-qualifying applicants to help us limit it?
Sure, that's a really good question, and to be honest, that's why a lot of schools work with us as a pre-screening service. So they'll take a look at one of our interviews before they will grant a Skype interview or before they'll accept an application sometimes, just to filter those students out. So to hop online, you can take a look at a 10-minute verified video interview of the applicant, and then you can decide whether or not to pursue that applicant or not. But it's worked well for a lot of our schools. Something else, and this goes into kind of the management of the admission office, is that you need to keep a really firm line to the point of where you may feel you're being rude to applicants. Because what happens, I'm sure you're familiar with this, they'll call and say, oh, I want to get an interview for my son. He's going to be in town next week. I'm sorry, we don't have any interview spaces, and we looked at your son's SAT scores, and they're a bit too low to be considered at our school. I'm sorry. 5 minutes later, they call somebody else in your admissions office. 5 minutes after that, they call somebody else, hoping to get a different answer. So really, for Chinese applicants, and creating just a really firm line saying, I'm sorry, this is our policy. And I tell people, there's a phrase in Chinese, which when I learned it was the magical phrase. In Chinese, it's 没办法. And in Chinese, in English, it translates to impossible. So instead of saying no, no doesn't really mean no in China. When you say no, it doesn't have the same connotation as it does in English. When you say, I'm sorry, that's impossible, we can't do that, it actually sends a clearer message that translates better in Chinese when you're speaking with different families, agents, and applicants. So rethinking the admissions process, it's useful, I think, for working with Chinese students, just because if you've limited resources, especially in a boarding school, you're doing everything as admissions director. You're doing marketing probably, and admissions for domestic applicants, whereas really you should be focusing your time and energy, because that's where it's a lot harder. But all of a sudden, you have 200 Chinese applicants to interview, and you're only going to take 3. So yeah, it's become a breaking point for a lot of schools, and why a lot of schools choose to work with us.
Sammy Marshall is asking, we have a very real problem in obtaining medical records, especially immunization records, from our Chinese students. Any suggestion on how to stress how important these documents are?
Yeah, it's a good call, and that's where it gets scary too. I mean, when it comes, if you're faking a transcript, it's one thing, but when you're faking medical records, it's difficult, and I think it's just again, it's a cultural misunderstanding. Here a lot of times you just have to fake documents to get things that you need, and it's pretty common. I would compare it a little bit to like a CV, or your resume. So if, in the United States, we know people polish a resume to an extent. So when you look at a resume, you think, okay, well, they're probably not this good, but they're probably, they didn't change things too much. And kind of where that line is, especially between cultures, it's difficult. For the medical part, I mean, off the top of my head, I don't really know. I think the best thing I can think of would be having them get them from an international hospital here. So like, for example, in Beijing, there's Beijing Family United, which would be more trustworthy on immunization records. But that's just off the top of my head. I actually haven't given much thought to that problem.
Okay, so I guess what's the golden question here from Tara Breed, if we can't rely on transcripts, recommendations, or the validity of a Skype interview, what can we rely on to assess an applicant?
Sure. We believe it's the face-to-face interview. Yeah, that's the best way to understand, the student's personality. And I think a lot of times too, when you're looking at applicants, it's the extrovert, especially from foreign cultures, that do well when they come to a U.S. campus. Ones that aren't afraid to make mistakes, ones that aren't afraid to converse with people, even though they're not going to speak perfectly. High school's that awkward time, even where native English speakers aren't speaking that much because they just feel awkward. But meeting somebody face to face, you get a really good idea of the student's ability and just really who they are as a person. And I think, to be honest, you really have to rely on your gut when you're doing the submissions work, especially with international applicants, but Chinese in particular, and say, I feel like this is going to be a really strong applicant. And when Chinese students struggle in school, very little of the time is it with academics. They're very, very smart. It's with the language component. So there's no doubt that they're going to work very hard when they get to campus, but it's usually just the language component. And I believe the face-to-face interview, just really seeing who that student is what you can rely on most. And I wish I had saying something with specific numbers and say, oh, you can do this and this, but this is really where admissions is more of an art than a science.
Okay, thank you so much. We're out of questions, and it's 4:04, so that's perfect timing. I want to thank our audience for tuning in, and a special thank you to Chris again for starting his day so early in order to provide this excellent webinar. Just as a reminder, I will send all registrants a link to the online webinar page where a recording and a PDF of this presentation will be made available. I'll also include a link to Chris's presentation on his website as well. Thanks again. Good luck with your process this season, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.